We talk a lot about different MCMC methods on this podcast because they are the workhorses of the Bayesian models, but other methods exist out there in the wild to infer the posterior distributions of your models, like Sequential Monte Carlo, for instance, or also known as SMC. What? You've never heard of SMC? Well, perfect, because Nicolas Chopin is going to tell you all about it in this episode. A lecturer at the French University of ENSAE since 2006, Nicolas is one of the world experts on SMC. Before that, he graduated from Ecole Polytechnique and ENSAE, where he also did his PhD from 1999 to 2003. Outside of work, Nicolas enjoys spending time with his family, practicing aikido, and reading a lot of books. This is Learning Bayesian Statistics with not one, but two French accents, episode 82, recorded April 11, 2023. Welcome to Learning Bayesian Statistics, a fortnightly podcast on Bayesian inference, the methods, the projects, and the people who make it possible. I'm your host, Alex Andorra. You can follow me on Twitter at Alex_Andorra, like the country. For any info about the podcast, learnbayestats.com is la place to be. Show notes, becoming a corporate sponsor, supporting LBS on Patreon, unlocking Bayesian merch, everything is in there. That's learnbayestats.com. If with all that info, a Bayesian model is still resisting you, or if you find my voice especially smooth and want me to come and teach Bayesian stats in your company, then reach out at alex.andorra@pymc-labs.io or book a call with me at learnbayestats.com. Thanks a lot, folks, and best Bayesian wishes to you all.
Let me show you how to be a good Bayesian. Change your predictions after taking information in. And if you're thinking I'll be less than amazing, let's adjust those expectations.
What's a Bayesian? Is someone who cares about evidence and doesn't jump to assumptions based on intuitions and prejudice. A Bayesian makes predictions on the best available info and adjusts the probability, cause every belief is provisional. And when I kick a flow, mostly I'm watching eyes widen, maybe cause my likeness lowers expectations of tight rhyming. How would I know unless I'm rhyming in front of a bunch of blind men, dropping placebo-controlled science like I'm Richard Feynman?
Hello, my dear Bayesians. I am very happy to welcome yet another member in our LBS Patreon community. This time, I am talking about the fantastic Kurt Tekolster. Thank you so much, Kurt. I'm super grateful for your support. It helps for a lot of things, podcast-wise, but especially for editing. And I am looking forward to talking with you in the LBS Slack. Oh, another thing I wanted to share with you. My friend and fellow PyMC developer Maxim Kochurov has put together a series of webinars that he calls State of Bayes. Honestly, I've seen the content and it is breathtaking. So I had to share it with you on the podcast. And if you are a data practitioner and want to deepen your understanding of Bayesian modeling, I strongly encourage you to check it out. Maxim walks you through advances in practical methods, how to introduce prior knowledge, the big concepts of advanced statistical models. You go from A/B testing to linear regression, from Gaussian processes to time series. It is a trove of Bayesian wisdom, I swear. And even better, it is completely free. You can subscribe on Meetup to attend the upcoming webinars, and you can check out PyMC Labs' YouTube channel to watch past lessons from Maxime. And of course, I put the links in the show notes. What did you expect? Okay, now let's talk SMC with Nicolas. Nicolas Chopin, bienvenue sur Learning Bayesian Statistics.
Thank you. Merci.
So yet again, a French person. Damn, I'm starting to expand the universe of Bayesian French people. And I'm really happy to have you on the show. Several people have been recommending you, including Bob Carpenter and Osvaldo Martin. So thank you to the both of you, Bob and Osvaldo, if you're listening. And Nicolas is on the show now. And actually, Nicolas, I think you're the first one from the ENSAE University to be on the show. So I'm quite glad. I'm also glad to hear that Bayesian stats are taught and in good hands with you at the ENSAE. I don't know if other people know about ENSAE, but me as a French educated person, of course I know about ENSAE. So I'm pretty happy to have you on the show, and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
So, as usual, I have so many questions for you. so that listeners know kind of a summary, we'll be talking mainly about SMC, Sequential Monte Carlo, because that's one of your specialties. We'll also talk a bit about INLA, so that's integrated nested Laplace approximation, which a lot of listeners have been asking about. The show is going to be mainly about SMC because that's really your specialty, but you also are very knowledgeable about INLA. So I wanted to take that opportunity before actually having the opportunity to do a full show about INLA. And so basically that's going to be that. But of course, as usual, let's start with your origin story. So can you tell us, Nicolas, how did you come to the stats and data world and how sinuous of a path that was?
My path to applied mathematics was quite direct because I was always a fan of mathematics. When I was a kid, I remember reading a magazine and there was this scientist who was doing applied mathematics for rocket science, actual rocket science. I said, wow, applied mathematics, that's what I want to do. So it's not very original, but I always wanted to do math. But in France, going to stats, people, at least for my generation, it's not so obvious because we were not taught statistics in high school and in universities or grande école. You learn probability maybe in the third year of undergraduate degree and maybe stats later. And it was a bit looked down. So, and also, this is maybe not very interesting to the listeners, but at the beginning, I wanted to go to computer science. I was a bit of a nerd. I guess I'm still a nerd. And I wanted to do computer science. And for some reason, I ended up at the ENSAE. I really hated economics. Oops, maybe I should not do that openly. And that was not my thing, but the stats part was the part that really attracted me most. It was not taught so well at the time. Again, oops, I shouldn't say that so directly. And I hope we do a better job that we used to. But still, I really liked it and I got interested. And maybe it's interesting to mention at the time, I had no idea what was machine learning because at the time, statistics was really detached. There was like a wall between probability and statistics and machine learning at the same time. So yeah, that's the gist of it. But I applied mathematics from the start, but statistics took me more time. Mm-hmm. But I guess it's quite common, this kind of thing. But
yeah, I can guess, at least for the French educated people, me, it was exactly the same thing, actually. Was much more into math. And it's true that you get taught much more, at least at the time. I don't know now. I hope it changed.
It's better.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that you're teaching at ENSAE is just like the first testimonial that it did change. But it's true that, I did a lot of linear algebra, a lot of basically very conceptual math, which I loved, to be honest. Linear algebra is actually super useful also. So I'm not saying we shouldn't teach linear algebra. It's like a pillar of the methods we're using today. But stats, for me at least, was just really awful because it was only pen and paper stats. And so that was super boring. I was like, and I'm not that good of I'm not a machine. So I don't compute that fast and that reliably. And so it's like, I don't understand why I'm doing that stuff, and also it limits the kind of problems that you can work on because you have to compute with your brain and the human brain is not really good at that. So I was like, I don't really understand the problems I'm working on and I don't see how they are interesting. Whereas if you had taught me statistics the way I learned it later on by myself, which was with a computer and simulating distributions and simulating events and scenarios, well then I think I would have been hooked way faster because it's just awesome to simulate everything and see basically the distributions existing in front of you.
Amen to that.
Yeah, I mean, if we have time, for sure, we'll talk about a bit more about that educational aspect because I'm really curious about how you see that and how you do that at ENSAE. But first, maybe can you tell us actually, so you said you started more with applied math really early, but now you're doing way more of a stats-oriented research. And so how did that happen?
So no, I guess it's a bit like you said. I mean, initially stats didn't look so exciting, but it's really following Robert's course, which was Christian was my PhD advisor, but I started to see the connection between computation and statistics, and Bayesian statistics also was very appealing to me, and that's how I progressively turned towards statistics in the last year at the ENSAE, following Christian's course mostly.
Oh, I see.
I'm not sure I understood. I really
that was exactly my question.
But
okay, yeah, I see.
Christian was a big influence on me, even before I did a PhD with him. But maybe I should not be said too openly, but Christian's teaching, where 100 students, we will be 2-3 students like me who would really like it. And big majority will find it goes too fast. There's too many things. So yeah, it's not the majority who might appreciate its course. But, at the time, it was super fast when he was teaching. But I really loved it personally.
Yeah, I mean, that's really cool to hear about these like kind of life-changing courses, classes in a way. Yeah. And what about Bayesian stats in particular? Do you remember when you first got introduced to them?
So to be a bit more precise, what happened is that I was I did Ecole Polytechnique in France, and I ended up with at the end of Polytechnique you might go to these special tracks for civil servant, and I did that, but I was really unsure about my choice. And in this track, you go to the ENSAE, for instance, in my case, and I realized I wanted to do a PhD. And I had to contact people in the administration to be sure I could do PhDs. And they said, it should be about economics, econometrics. And there was this one econometrician who wanted to play a bit with Bayesian statistics. So that's why I got in touch with Christian Robert even before I started this course. And I started reading his book. And I started to discover MCMC and Bayesian statistics at the same time. So I got really excited about it even before starting his course. So And I guess the idea of staying in the world of probability, that's what Bayesian statistics does. So probability is beautiful. It's very technical, but it's quite beautiful. And with Bayesian statistics, you're still in the realm of probability. I think that's what really appealed to me. Whereas standard statistics, classical stuff, it's always, we have this problem, let's do this, and with a problem, let's do this. It looks much less principled. At least to my naive eyes at the time, it looked like that. So it looks like Bayesian statistics was much more principled, a very nice idea. You represent your prior knowledge or lack of knowledge for a distribution, and then you get the posterior. I got the idea immediately, and I stick to it.
Yeah, I
used to teach a statistics course, and it was funny because I could see some students really ticked with Bayesian statistics, the others were not happy with it. So I guess there's something in your brain. Some people are Bayesian and some are not. I don't know. But anyway.
Yeah, that's actually a topic I like talking about in the podcast, especially with neuroscientists. So episode 77 is actually a lot about that with Pascal Wallisch. And I think episode 81 with Alan Stocker, where we go into that and especially how people perceive visual speed, for instance, which is really related to priors and help you understand which parts of the brain are actually Bayesian and which parts are not. And that's a pretty fascinating topic. I'll definitely put these 2 episodes in the show notes for people who want to dig deeper if they haven't listened to them. And actually, so now, can you define for listeners the work that you're doing nowadays and the topics that you are particularly interested in.
Right. So I'm still very much interested in the fundamentals of Monte Carlo. So just even if you're not in statistics, you just want to approximate an integral, how do you do it? And that's funny because there's still work to be done. There's still stuff to establish. We don't have a final word yet, so that's kind of fun. And you don't necessarily consider a posterior distribution as your target. Could be anything. But sometimes knowing about statistics gives you insight about constructing good Monte Carlo algorithms. So to be a bit more precise, I'm talking about, I have this recent paper with Mathieu Gerber where we try to answer the following question. You want to compute an integral in dimension D, and your budget is n evaluation of your integrand f. What is the best rate of convergence you can get for your approximation? Vanilla Monte Carlo would be one of the square root of n, but you can actually do better if you're ready to assume that your function is smooth in some sense. Yeah. And so there are results that tells you the optimal rate. If you have, for whatever random algorithm, the optimal rate will be 1 over n power minus 1/2 minus r over d, where r is the regularity and d is the dimension. It has been known since the 50s. And with Mathieu, we managed to come up with algorithms that reach these optimal rates.
Okay.
And we are not the only one to work on this. François Portier from Rennes ENSAE, which is associated to the ENSAE, but it's in Rennes in France. He has another paper with Rémi Leluc where they look at the same problem and they come up with a different solution. So that's funny because Monte Carlo is like an old method. I mean vanilla Monte Carlo.
Yeah.
But there's still stuff to be done in this direction. So that's one thing. And also these days I work a lot on sequential Monte Carlo samplers. So that's where you use sequential Monte Carlo maybe to sample from one fixed distribution. Even if you define a sequence of distribution, you're actually interested in just a single distribution. And so I've done work recently on that, trying to come up with more efficient SMC samplers. And I'm still working on it. That's a big part of my research. And these days I happen to supervise PhD theses, which are more applied, which is very interesting too. So one in cardiology with a cardiologist, where we try to predict sudden death. I'm smiling, but that's a pretty dramatic problem. And if we could predict that people have a high chance of getting sudden death, you could maybe save lives. And other applied work on cosmology and cognitive sciences. But each time I was lucky to end up with PhD students who wanted to do this kind of applied work. And that's difficult, but it's also very rewarding. And also you need to find colleagues in other areas of science who want to work with you. But it's something I also do, and I find it really interesting too.
That was actually you kind of answered my next questions, which was related to, you're doing very theoretical stuff, and basically I wanted you to explain us how, which impact it actually has, and the applications. And I mean, you basically answered. I didn't even know you were doing all these different, very different applications. That sounds really, really interesting. So please put any links in the show notes to any papers or theses or anything that came out of that, because I think people are going to be very interested. So any cosmology papers or medicine papers, or even the paper you mentioned, you just did put that improving Monte Carlo algorithms. For sure. That's awesome, because I'm sure there are all types of listeners on this podcast, so they will all be happy with that. For sure. This will be in the show notes, people, so definitely take a look. So actually, you mentioned it. I think now is a good time to dive a bit into that. Sequential Monte Carlo, because that's really one of your main areas of research. So we haven't talked a lot about that on the show yet. Can you basically tell us what sequential Monte Carlo is to start with?
Yes, I think it's important to start with that. Thank you for this question, because there's a few misconceptions about SMC. So I like to start with saying that I think most people have heard about SMC, but they're a bit confused because by SMC, we mean slightly different things. So on one hand, there are what I would call a particle filter. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of SMC algorithm you use in a specific scenario when you have time series data and you want to learn sequentially some latent variable from your model. So the model will be hidden Markov or a state space model. And this model arises a lot, for instance, in signal processing, where you want to track a boat or a car, or to do car navigation, stuff like that. So XT would be your hidden state.
Population models also. Yeah. Population models, for instance, of like you're trying to infer the population of sharks or things like that. And actually, for listeners, there is a whole episode about HMM's hidden Markov models. I'll put that in the show notes. It was with Vianney Leos Barajas, who is doing cool work about that, and especially for these kinds of models. So I'll let you continue, Nicolas.
Yeah, so when you have a hidden Markov model or a model which is a dynamic model with dynamic state hidden variables, you might want to do filtering. So filtering is trying to recover this latent variable sequentially. And then you do this kind of sequential Monte Carlo algorithm. Mm-hmm. A related approach is the Kalman filter. Mm-hmm. The Kalman filter is what you do when you have a specific type of state space model, which is linear and Gaussian. And then computing the filtering distribution is like computing the mean variance of a certain Gaussian distribution. And then you can do everything exactly, so you don't need Monte Carlo. And the Kalman filtering has been popular since the 60s, the 70s. It's really important in a lot of signal processing tasks and other problems. But if your problem is not linear or Gaussian, you do maybe a particle filter. So that's one thing, and that's very interesting. And I did some work on this. I'm not the main contributor. It's a lot of people have worked on this.
Yeah, but that's really, thanks for talking about that, because it's something I've covered a lot on the show. So that's cool that you're mentioning that. And I saw also that you added a 2-hour introduction to particle filters that you did on YouTube, and that's in the show notes, folks. So if you're interested in particle filters, definitely take a look at that.
And the other thing, when we say SMC, we might also mean SMC samplers, mm-hmm. which are algorithms that they are the same type of algorithm, because you do something sequentially, and what you do sequentially is to simulate random variables, and you compute weight for an important sampling step, and then you might have some Markov step. But what is different is you consider any sequence of distribution. It doesn't need to be related to a hidden Markov model. Mm-hmm. And in particular, you could be interested in sampling from a posterior distribution, but you just introduce a sequence of distribution. For instance, it could be the prior, then the posterior given 1 data point, when 2 data points, 3 data points. Or instead, you could do tampering, where between the prior and the posterior, you consider a pseudo-posterior, which would be prior times likelihood power something, and where the exponent is between 0 and 1. And you try to interpolate between the prior and posterior. Or it could be any sequence of distribution, and maybe you're really interested in each member of the sequence, or maybe you're just creating an artificial sequence to sample from the terminal distribution, which is the distribution of interest. Okay, and then when you do this kind of thing, and in particular where the way you mutate the particles is through MCMC steps, then we're in the realm of SMC samplers. And that's why and if I may add a few words about this, the advantage of SMC samplers, I mean, because you could use MCMC instead, but the big advantage is that, some of the big advantages is that because you have many particles together, then it's much easier to parallelize your algorithm compared to MCMC, which is sequential in nature. So you have this parallelization, which comes for free, which is embarrassingly easy to do. And also compared to MCMC, you get an estimate of marginal likelihood, which is something difficult to get in MCMC. And third advantage is that because you have this particle sample at every time t, it makes, if you try to come up with recipes to automatically choose certain tuning parameters of the algorithm, it's much easier. Just because you have a population of points rather than one point in standard MCMC. I hope this is clear to the listeners, but what I'm trying to say is that adaptive MCMC is essentially hard because at every time t you just have 1 point, or maybe you have a complete chain, but maybe it was started in a bad state, maybe you're not mixing so well. Whereas in SMC samplers, you have many particles, and we have ways now to make sure they are almost, if you resample a small number, they essentially follow from the current target distribution. You started me on my favorite subject, so I'll talk for 10 minutes, sorry.
Yeah.
I hope, please interrupt if there's anything you want me to clarify.
Yeah. So all the different topics you just talked about right now, so hidden Markov models, particle filters, all the different types of models you've just mentioned are more appropriate. It would be very appropriate to use an SMC method or an SMC sampler because it will be more efficient.
In which model or statistical problems would I use SMC samplers? Essentially, in any situation where you could use a Metropolis kernel instead, like even maybe Nuts or Langevin, etc. The reason I'm saying this is because you could find models where you would like to do Gibbs sampling instead, and maybe a Gibbs sampler would be hard to beat because the Gibbs sampler, the big advantage is that it really takes into account the specific structure of your model. Mm-hmm. That said, I mean, I'm been known to be a bit critical of Gibbs sampling, and I wrote a paper with a colleague on logistic regression, and for this particular problem, we found that Gibbs sampling was not actually very competitive with even random walk Metropolis. Because the big drawback of Gibbs samplers, on the other hand, is that they are very specialized. You give me a model, you give me a prior, maybe I can derive a Gibbs sampler. And I change a bit the prior, and you have to work again and derive another Gibbs sampler. So maybe you use then bugs or related software to derive the Gibbs sampler for you. But still, it's a very specialized tool, and it requires a lot of work compared to random walk Metropolis or other approaches like that, which just require you to be able to compute the log target density. But there must be cases, I'm pretty sure, in all the statistical models you consider, you may consider you can end up in a situation where Gibbs samplers are the only viable option. I'm ready to believe that. But if you're not in such a case where it's, in my view, SMC samplers can be used in any other problem, where you would do instead MCMC or any kind of Metropolis sampler, Langevin, Nuts, random walk, whatever you fancy.
So yeah, I think a good thing also to give listeners an idea is, and you started doing that a bit, so feel free now to dive a bit more into that. Maybe give people an intuition of what the main difference is between MCMC and SMC samplers is, basically. And that will also, I think, give people an intuition of where, when and where SMC would be interesting for their problems.
That's a tricky one, but because my understanding of this has changed recently. Mm-hmm. The thing to see is that when you use a SMC sampler, at time t, when you resample the particles, you have to move them according to MCMC kernel. So we're using MCMC essentially. And we have this recent paper with which I will add to the show notes, I have this recent paper with Ai Dongdo, my former PhD student, where we propose a slightly different type of SMC sampler called a waste-free SMC. And we derive the asymptotic variance, and we get an asymptotic variance which is very much the same as you would if you would use the MCMC kernel you use at time t. So you could say it's not better, not worse than MCMC, it's exactly the same. Right? So we're using MCMC. We're not doing better than MCMC or worse, in a sense. But what we gain is that we have, as I said before, we gain this ability to do like independent MCMC chains a bit by construction. So that's good for parallelization. And that's also, we also in this paper propose a way to estimate the asymptotic variance, which is based on the remark that doing this algorithm, you have almost like an independent chain, so you can just do the empirical variance, right? And also the third point I made before, yes, essentially, so the way to understand what we do is that we define a sequence of distribution. We go through this different distribution for reweighting steps, etc. Then we do this MCMC steps. So at every time t, it looks like we do MCMC, but for instance, let's say we do random walk metropolis. The big issue with random walk metropolis, you get very bad performance if you don't calibrate the random walk steps. It's critical. But here you have your current particle sample that tell you exactly, or not exactly, but gives you a very good idea of the shape of the current distribution. And you can use that to calibrate your random walk metropolis. We are not doing better than MCMC, but we kind of get like the best of MCMC, whereas if you just do standard MCMC or even adaptive MCMC, that would be hard to get. That's my pitch. I don't know how obviously clear it is, but plus again, parallelization. I mean, for instance, if you know JAX in Python, there's this guy, Rémi Lelouf, that you might have already interviewed him maybe, who developed BlackJax. So in BlackJax, they did a waste-free SMC already. And if you use this, then your SMC sampler is going to be implemented more or less automatically on the GPU. And it's going to be 100 times faster than any MCMC just because it's parallel and you use the GPU, you exploit this property.
Yeah, that's really cool.
I'm sorry, it's hard to explain this properly because it's a bit subtle.
No, I think you're doing a good job. That's pretty hard. And I mean, this episode is here to introduce people to the topics, and then they can see if it actually fits what they are working on or what they are curious about these days. And then if they are, definitely refer to the show notes or get in touch with me or with Nicolas, and then you'll get going.
If I could add a story that maybe would make illustrate this a bit better, is I have this colleague, Robin Ryder, who is doing great work on applied Bayesian statistics and in linguistics, for instance. It's really nice stuff. Actually, you might consider inviting him because his talks are always very, very interesting. And he gave this talk where he started, I think we all agree that the only reason we do SMC is because, usually it's because Nicolas is in the room, we want to make him happy. Otherwise, but this is a problem where we started to do MCMC and we never managed to make it work, so we turned to SMC. And so they had this iPlot problem, which was their posterior was quite high dimensional. There was some structure, but no obvious way to exploit it. And whatever kind of MCMC they tried to use, impossible to get decent performance. And in the end, they did this tampering SMC approach. Mm-hmm. And so tampering is just a way to define a certain sequence of distribution. And then they managed to make it work. So just to say, I mean, there are people who actually end up with very hard problems because their posterior is high dimensional and very hard to calibrate. And if you try SMC, it's not really SMC that saves you. It's that using SMC, you could use, for instance, tampering. And with tampering, you can start at the distribution where it's easy to move around quickly, and then you progressively reduce the temperature. And in the end, and you really get something that starts to work. So I just want to say, there's still not so many people who are convinced, but I've already had an example in the wild of concrete, difficult problems where the claims I'm making on this show are actually shown to old in this case, at least.
Yeah, no, definitely super interesting. And yeah, so I encourage people who are interested to look at the show notes and study all of these, because I'm definitely super curious about that, and also read about it, because it's another way of getting to the posterior distributions, and so it's never very intuitive. It always takes a bit of time to get familiarized to it. So if you're completely lost, don't worry, that's completely normal, and it comes from time and repetition and actually using those tools. So, and actually, before diving into when does SMC break, basically the frontiers right now of SMC, actually for people who want to try out SMC, do you have any package that you would recommend? How can people try that out in their own work and projects?
So I've developed this Python package called Particles.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a nasty PhD advisor, so I forced my PhD student to use it. And this way I can see where the documentation is not so great and stuff. And also I say PhD student, but also I teach a course on SMC at the ENSAE third year. So I recommend the students to use it. And from year to, I can see every year the proportion increases, so the documentation is getting better and better. So yes, you can use my package, and I developed it while writing this book I wrote with Omiros Papalipoulos. So it was meant to illustrate the book, but also it implements all these waste-free SMC samplers for different scenarios. And alternatively, again, in Blackjacks, you have an implementation of waste-free SMC. So that's another option. I've not played with it so much, but that's the two implementation I'm familiar with. Otherwise, you will find mostly code that people have developed for a certain project, but that's the only two packages I know which try to offer a general package you might use in different scenarios.
Yeah.
And it's on GitHub, and if you don't understand how to use it, feel free to raise an issue on GitHub, and I'll try to answer it quickly.
I just added Blackjacks to the show notes. So yeah, when you have the time, definitely add the link to your package, Particles, to the show notes. Is that can people just Conda install it or pip install it? Perfect. So folks, it's available on pip and Conda, so just install away, and we'll put a link to the GitHub repo in the show notes so that people can look around, and if you find any issues, open one on the GitHub, and if you know how to solve it or are willing to learn how to solve it, well, open a PR. I'm sure Nicolas will be absolutely thrilled. Okay, so that's cool. So people can use that. And then one question will be, so what are the current frontiers of SMC right now? So what I mean by that is, when does it break, and when should it be avoided preferentially?
I have this not so recent paper with Pierre Jacob and Alexander Buchholz, where we managed to make it work in dimension 4000. So dimension is not such an issue, at least if you use specifically tampering sequences, I think. But I'm not sure that the type of SMC sampler I'm talking about will work so well if you had a high dimensional problem with very separated modes. Because as I told you, you manage to get the best out of MCMC, but MCMC is not so good at jumping from one region to the other. So yes, multimodality is still not something that is handled gracefully by SMC samplers, just because the MCMC kernel we're gonna use are not so well suited for that. So when you use tampering at least at the beginning, you move around between the different regions because sampling reduce drastically the walls between the different regions. So you might manage to get a lot of particles everywhere, but then so it will still be better than just a standard MCMC, but not great. So that's one of the things I want to work. That's one of my projects at the moment to try to make SMC samplers work better. More generally, for problems where the posterior is far from Gaussian, right? Because multimodality is it's a funny problem, but in the end of the day, I mean, people always look at target distribution, which is a Gaussian mixture, and we don't really care about that. And I'm not sure that model people use always have so many well-separated modes. Maybe not. But also you could imagine like banana shapes or weird shapes that are difficult to explore. That's still something we need to improve, I would think.
That's good to know. I'm guessing that these are topics that you're working on. And yeah, actually on that, I'm curious in like the next improvement that you'd like to see on SMC, what would it be?
Well, that's exactly that. I mean, I just don't want to reveal too much because it's the topic of a PhD project that might start in September. But yeah, I mean, as I said before, the very nice thing about SMC samplers is that you have a sample that you can use to learn features of your distribution to better calibrate your MCMC step. And I want to improve this part for nasty posteriors or nasty targets, which by nasty, I mean really weird shapes, high dimension, whatever, stuff like that. So I have some ideas and I have a student who is willing to do this PhD. So that's the kind of thing I like to work on. And maybe also looking into machine learning techniques like neural networks and flows could be useful, but I'm not sure. I mean, that's something we could look into as well.
Thanks a lot for that overview of SMC. That's super cool. We've never done that on the show yet that I remember, because now it's been almost 90 episodes, so it's a long time. But that's awesome. I hope that will be useful to people. I'm pretty sure the show notes will be quite full for this episode, folks. So if you are interested, if you're curious about it, definitely take a look. Now we're going to switch a bit and actually talk about another method that you are familiar with, even though you're saying that you're not that familiar with, but I think a lot of people would disagree. And that's called INLA. So that stands for Integrated Nested Laplace Approximations. And well, actually, I have pending to invite one of the main INLA's inventors, whose name is Harvard Rue. I'm working on getting him on the show, folks, and Nicolas actually is going to help me. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for Harvard and we'll do a full INLA episode, Nicolas, can you give us the rundown about INLA and basically tell listener what this is about? What does integrated nested Laplace approximations mean?
All right. So the keyword here, important one, is the Laplace approximation. And it's INLA is one of these fast deterministic approximation of the posterior. Mm-hmm. So it's a completely different beast compared to sampling algorithms like MCMC, SMC. It's not going to be exact in the limit as the number of samples go to infinity. It's just some fast approximation you compute, it's deterministic. And so we could also mention variational Bayes or expectation propagation, this kind of thing that comes more from machine learning. What is nice about INLA is that it really comes from some statistical understanding of your model, right? So you look at these special models where you have a latent variable which is Gaussian, and also typically that has Markov properties. So for instance, think about a territory like France. And you divide this territory in cells, like cities or departments. And for each cell, you have a latent variable, which is the propensity that this population to have a certain disease. And so the Markov property is here to say that these latent variables, they are related, they are correlated, but you depend only on your neighbors. Like if you're in Paris, it depends on the department, the north of Paris and the south of Paris, but not Marseille. So you can encode these Markov properties by through some properties of your Gaussian distribution. And so your posterior is going to be the distribution of X, your latent variables from here, the spatial model. And also you might have some fixed parameters in a vector theta, which typically is low dimensional. The big insight is that if you fix theta, and if you look at the Laplace approximation of the posterior given theta for X, is going to be pretty good, actually. And this is because for this type of spatial model where you assume this quotient latent variable, etc., the Gaussian Markov random field, the prior is quite informative. The dependencies between your neighbors, this local spatial dependency, is really given by the prior. And the likelihood, the data that you observe at each part of France, for instance, is informative, the state at each location, but it's not really informative on these dependencies. So because of this, the Laplace approximation works pretty well. And then in INLA, you build on this, you leverage this to, so you do that fix for fixed theta, and then you approximate the margin of for given theta, and then you have grid of theta values. So I don't want to get too much into the specific details. First, because it's hard to do with that blackboard, and second, I don't feel so legitimate because, as I told you, Alexandre, it's really Overdrew that has developed the INLA for the last 5-10 years, and he would be in better position to explain all this. I mean, I was on the INLA paper more or less because I was visiting Harvard at the right time, and that's mostly his ideas, and he's more familiar than I am with this type of nice spatial temporal model where you could use INLA. But the big thing to understand is that INLA works wonderfully for a certain class of models. And you understand that if you really have some good statistical understanding of these models, which are called Gaussian Markov random fields. And there are some nice extensions based on SPDs and stuff like that. And so you have to read all these papers by Harvard to make sense of this. And also what is beautiful, and that had some influence on me, I must say, is that Harvard understood from the start that this method will catch up only if you develop some software behind it, which will be really plug and play for practitioners, right? So you have this ability to describe your model through 2 or 3 lines of R. Then you have this underlying INLA engine that you run, and it will compute automatically your approximation. It's super fast, and this is models where MCMC, GIP samplers have been developed for some time, but compared to this, they are just 1,000 times slower. So they are not a serious alternative in that respect. So that's really neat. So I'm a big fan, but I have to be honest again, I'm not the best person to explain, especially the recent progresses that has been made. And what is really important is that software has been developed, which is super user-friendly, and it works very well for certain models. And it's not a universal approach, which is why I like it too, because it works very well. There's a good understanding now, I think, from people like Harvard, like why it works so well for certain models. And this is it.
I think that's already useful. And I already put the original INLA paper in the show notes. And actually, I think that'd be useful for people. So if you know of any good tutorials about INLA, first, to put that in the show notes. And second, a link to the software that you were talking about so that people who want to try out INLA can experiment with it?
The documentation of INLA is really beautiful, and there's all these models for each model, and there's an example, there's a EAR code, and so it describes a bit like, I don't know if you're familiar with Winbug manual, which is pretty famous because it used to have all these models and data sets, example, and for each example, it will give exactly the bugs code to implement it. So the INLA documentation, the is the same, and that's super convenient. So for practitioner, if your model has already been implemented, you just copy and paste.
Oh yeah, well, that's perfect. Yeah, so definitely put a link to that in the show notes. That's perfect. Sounds exactly.
And if I'm not mistaken, there are books to buy at Harvard recently that people should check out. I will add links to these books.
Awesome. Damn, the show notes for this episode. That's cool. Anything you want to add about INLA that you didn't mention and feel like you should?
No, not really. I don't feel like I'm an important contributor to INLA, but on the hand, I really appreciate that working on this gave me a different perspective on Bayesian computation. It got me interested more in deterministic approximation to this kind of pragmatic approach, and also the idea of offering software. If you don't provide software for a new method, that people might never use it, etc. So it had a very positive impact of my research, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, I completely agree with that. It's definitely super interesting to have that other part of the research, which is more deterministic approach instead of approximations like MCMC and SMC. I think if we can really have both sides, that's really awesome, because then it will make Bayes even more versatile and able to adapt to a lot of different circumstances. So definitely I'm all in for that. And that's why I think it's important to cover it on the show. Also because personally, I don't know a lot about INLA, for instance. I'm way more used to approximation methods, of course, especially any flavor of MCMC. SMC already is something that I use way less, but I have a bit more intuitions about it. But INLA is something that I still need to learn and want to learn, because it's kind of a different paradigm. So yeah, definitely curious about it. And yeah, then the software part is, yeah, as you were saying, to me, extremely important. That's also why I think open source software like Stan or PyMC are extremely important, because they allow you to basically outsource the heavy lifting math part that just a few people can and want to do. And then for people who are more interested in the code, or who just are not very math prone, well, they can code their model up and leave the math parts, which are extremely complicated, to people who actually enjoy it and are really good at it. And that's why, instead of making your own samplers, using samplers that have been waterproofed by the open source development workflow is actually extremely important. And then it's a multiplier of power in a sense, because I don't think I could work on all the models I'm working on right now if it were not for PyMC, for instance, because I'm not a mathematician. So if I had to develop my own algorithm, that would take me way longer, and I would end up with algorithms that are way less efficient than those I can use right now. So that's cool. I think we're getting short on time. So before I ask you the last two questions, I want to talk a bit about expectation propagation, or EP, because that's one of the topics you also work a lot on. And so, yeah, what can you tell us about expectation propagation? I think you in particular have a paper recently about that. I like the title, Leave Pima Indians Alone. It's about binary regression. I put that already in the show notes. So yeah, tell us a bit about that so that people get an idea of what expectation propagation is and why that would be interesting.
If you don't mind, what I'm going to do is to describe briefly this paper because it's... I had this super bright, super efficient PhD student, James Ridgway. And at the time, I had this honest question, which was every time I open a paper on a new method on MCMC, the first numerical experiment is logistic regression or probit regression. And also, there are some people who develop several Gibbs samplers specifically for this problem. So I was thinking, at the end of the day, which of these methods should work better actually for logistic regression? And so in the end, we wrote this paper, which was a tentative review of all the methods you can use to compute a posterior, either Monte Carlo, so exact in the limit, or approximate, including expectation propagation. And we thought it would be nice because people in stats are not so familiar with expectation propagation because that comes from machine learning. And also one point so I think to make it short, but 2 points in the end, we wanted to make is first, what's the point of developing a Gibbs sampler for a given problem if a more generic approach, even like random multiple police, works better? Because we realized that for the dataset that people were looking at, the Gibbs sampler were not performing better. But again, they are more work because they are specialized algorithms. So what's the point? And the second point we wanted to make is, look, guys, there are this deterministic approximation, even Laplace, if you want. Okay, you want to ignore it, but if you use it only to get a first idea of what the posterior looks like and maybe to calibrate your MCMC sampler, it might make such a huge difference. So we were a bit, in the end of the day, initially my motivation for this paper was to complain about the lack of a benchmarking culture. Like people just come up with algorithms and they don't compare to anything. So that's one point we wanted to make. And then the third point was this. I mean, look, guys, you're developing a Gibbs sampler for this problem. Are you comparing to other methods? And people don't. All they do, they will compare to a basic MCMC sampler, but they will not calibrate it properly using this approximation. And it looks like an obvious thing to do, and it's so that was the point of the paper. And if listeners could have a look at the paper and yell at me if you completely disagree, you will not be the first one because the paper is not controversial, but not everybody was happy with our findings. And anyway, if we could start a discussion in the community about how do we compare algorithm, what is the best approach? If you have two approaches, can you make sure that if your approach is more specialized, require more work, you get actually better results? If you could also be a bit more open-minded about different methods like expectation propagation, or because then even if you dismiss it as something approximate, at least you could use it to even just start your chain, to have a good starting point. Why not? Etc., etc. So that's the point we were trying to make in 2 minutes. Sorry, it was a bit long. Please have a look at the paper and throw tomatoes at me later if you want, but I won't be mad. But I've stopped talking about this paper. I used to give talks about it for some time, but if this paper could have some impact on the community, that would be great. Or at least create some more reaction.
Yeah.
I know some people like the paper, but I also know people who don't, and they stay quiet about it. But anyway.
If you're looking for reaction, the fact that people don't like the paper is actually interesting, because that means at least it starts a debate, which it seems that is something you want.
Exactly.
I'd say that's pretty positive.
And just in a few words, I did not really say what is expectation propagation. It's a way to compute essentially a Gaussian approximation to your posterior, except it's a bit smarter for various reasons than Laplace. It's going to give you a better Gaussian approximation, and it relies on the factorization of the posterior. So if you have independent data points, you might be able to do it. One big limitation of EP is you have this particular technique to update your local approximation for a given site, and that's model dependent. But for Probit or Logit, we have a very nice solution. So
I see. Okay.
EP is a very curious algorithm. I don't pretend I understand it fully, and I can give references to recent papers that give a better understanding. But it's pretty neat when it works well. It was really, really well.
Yeah, so this is more related. So expectation propagation is something that's more related to INLA, for instance. That's the kind of deterministic algorithms than to SMC and MCMC, which are more approximation algorithms.
And it's also related to variational base.
Yeah, which is also a topic you're working on. Awesome. Well, I think this is really amazing, and I've already kept you a long time, so we can call it a show. Thanks a lot, Nicolas. But of course,
thank you for having me. That was really great.
I'm going to ask you the last 2 questions. Don't worry. It's not finished yet.
Yes. Someone I want to have dinner with.
So, yeah, first one is, if you had unlimited time and resources, which problem would you try to solve?
Why one problem? I like to work on many different things. It will be a nightmare to work only one problem. I don't know. I have to make a confession. I hate applying to grants or stuff like that. It's mostly because you have to commit yourself to something, and I could change my mind and tomorrow work on a different problem. That's the fun part of research. I never know what I'm working to work next, and I don't know. I don't want to commit myself. Sorry. That's what I love about academia and research is that you can always work on something else, and you never know what's going to come next. And I like this kind of certainty.
Nothing in the question, though, says that you should absolutely commit to one thing. Could be the first thing that you want.
Sorry.
Because you have unlimited time and resources, so, you can just try.
I'm always excited about the project I'm currently working, but then I will work on something else and I will be excited about that, etc., etc. So, but the stuff I already said in the show, like trying to make SMC sampler work better, that's one of the things I really want to work on. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I'm not surprised. I can feel your passion. And second question, if you could have dinner with any great scientific mind, dead, alive, or fictional, who would it be?
Fictional too? Oh, wow. Okay, I didn't get it. Mind with plural, or I can have different, I can mention several people. Or...
Yeah, go ahead.
So, in Bayesian computation, Charles Geyer is someone who wrote a lot of very nice papers. And because he's of an older generation, I've never met him. I'd be curious to meet him. So Charles Geyer is really someone, I love some of his papers. And Seymour Haber, same story, but most people might have not heard about him. Seymour Haber wrote 2 very nice papers in the 60s about Monte Carlo, which are kind of forgotten. And that's very sad. So I like to meet him and tell him that I've worked recently on stuff that is a bit like an extension of his work. And anyway, to make sense of what I've just said, you might want to have a look at the introduction on the paper of integration and Monte Carlo I mentioned at the very beginning. And otherwise, maybe Alan Turing, of course, or Gödel. But he was very shy, apparently. So Sophie Germain is a female mathematician, but she used to live close to the French Revolution, which is a very interesting time in history. Yeah,
very interesting, very strange, interesting life, Sophie Germain, for sure. And extremely brilliant woman who, of course, had difficulties doing math at a time where it was difficult for women to work in anything.
But apparently her family was let them do it because they were kind of wealthy. And so, but anyway, she looks a very interesting character.
Yeah.
Also, I'm a bit fascinated by the figure of Euclid because, it was 2,000 years ago. We don't have, I'm not sure if you could talk at all in any way, but 2,000 years ago, they already figured completely geometry. Just like it was already a closed subject 2,000 years ago. I found it fascinating myself. All these Greek philosophers and mathematicians, they figured so much. That's always been, that's always found it fascinating. I'm not sure we'll be able to communicate in any relevant way, but but there are a lot of people I respect. I like to talk to be honest, and it's just a few names. And
Awesome. Yeah. Well, super interesting. Does sound like a lot of fascinating dinners. So feel free to invite me. All right. So I think it's time to call it a show. Nicolas, thanks so much for coming on the show. That was really fascinating. I learned a lot. I'm a bit tired because I had to think a lot about math. So I need to eat something. But yeah, thanks a lot. I'm sure this was also challenging and interesting for listeners. As usual, and we said it a lot during this episode, I put resources and a link to our website in the show notes for those who want to dig deeper. Thank you again, Nicolas, for taking the time and being on this show.
Thanks for having me. That was great. It's a new experience to me, but it was really nice. Thanks a lot.
You bet. See you.
See you.
This has been another episode of Learning Bayesian Statistics. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show on your favorite podcatcher or on Podchaser, and visit learnbayesstats.com for more resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes that will help you reach true Bayesian state of mind. That's learnbayesstats.com. Our theme music is Good Bayesian by Baba Brinkman with MC Lars and Megaran. Check out his awesome work at bababrinkman.com. I'm your host, Alex Andorra. You can follow me on Twitter at Alex_Andorra, like the country. You can support the show and unlock exclusive benefits by visiting patreon.com/learnbayesstats. Thanks so much for listening and for your support. You're truly a
good Bayesian. Change your predictions after taking information in. And if you're thinking I'll be less than amazing, let's adjust those expectations. Let me show you how to be a good Bayesian. Change calculations after taking fresh data in. Those predictions that your brain is making, let's get them on a solid foundation.